So I split it down to sort of a 3-point process that we apply to all development appraisals that we do. And actually, it's very simple. There's no rewriting the book here.
Things like ESG actually is increasingly important, not just for consumers, but also for the lenders and how they're looking at mortgages on properties.
Whenever I'm looking at a site, I like to know if planning applications have been rejected. Why was that?
Hello, my name is Alex Harrington-Griffin. I'm your host of the Real Developer podcast, powered by the creators of Land Insight and Land Fund, the market-leading LandTech. In this episode, episode 5, my co-host Mitchell English from Strutt Group joined me to discuss the trends and tips around the new homes market. Our guests for this episode were Ross Allen from Hometrack and Charlotte Moxon from Strutt & Parker. Together, we discuss everything from the perfect appraisal to build-to-rent pricing and what's hot and what's not in the new build space. So on that note, let's get on with the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Developer Podcast. My name is Alex Harrington-Griffin. Welcome back for episode 5 of series 3. Today, we're going to be talking about new homes sales trends, the appraisals that developers have to go through to make sure they get their GDVs just right, and the data that informs those values as well. My co-host for today is Mitchell English from Strutt Group as well. Mitchell, thank you for taking on this role. Appreciate it.
No problem.
And our guests for today are two very, very deserved guests. We have Charlotte Moxon, Head of Regional New Homes for Strutt & Parker, part of the BNP Paribas Group. Hello, Charlotte.
Hello.
And Ross Allen, Director of Services at Hometrack, part of the Zoopla Group. Well, I got that right?
You have.
Good. It's a good start, then we can crack on. Let's jump into some of the questions. Our audience, being predominantly SME developers, are always keen to understand from the technology they use, from the systems they use for many, many years, how can they better inform what they're doing to de-risk? A huge part of Mitchell knows about any kind of development is making sure that you've got your numbers right, and obviously the data that goes in, your numbers are only as good as that data. From a Hometrack perspective, what does Hometrack do? How does it retrieve the data that it collects as well? And how does that support SME developers at the moment? Obviously in the context of your fantastic partnership with LandTech.
So we've been working with developers for well over 20 years now across the UK. Really, our primary focus is ensuring that they get good quality business grade data to drive their decisions. And so we work with a large number of partner businesses to pull together data from mortgage lenders, the NHBC, who we have an exclusive relationship with, and as part of the wider Houseful Group, where we have Zoopla, pulling in listings information to really drive good quality data that they can use as part of their appraisals for GDV, assessing sales rates, pricing for units, understanding supply and demand, affordability within local markets. We have a whole host of services that are used across what we think of as the property lifecycle. So thinking about buying, whether that be buying land or buying sites, buying units, development, so developing those actual units out, managing those assets. So we also work with a large portion of asset managers and housing associations who have large volumes of stock, and then disposing or selling of those units, whether that be to the open market, auction, or actually stock transfer from, say, one housing association to another or one institutional investor to another. We do that across SaaS-style platforms. We have a number of reports and systems and services that they can utilize to do that. And most importantly, very recently, we partnered with LandTech to support them with their fantastic services with Land Insight and Land Fund to bring in our market-leading comparable data to really support that development and appraisal of gross development value across sites.
There's a lot in there, a lot to unpack, and there's obviously a lot of things that you're taking you a long time to fine-tune as well. And obviously LandTech are very excited about the partnership. One of the key things that from a developer perspective, breaking it down and really the value in, is understanding the lag between the land registry and the data that Hometrack gets. How do you do that?
It's quite an interesting area. So we have an exclusive arrangement with mortgage lenders across the UK. We actually work with 18 of the 20 largest mortgage lenders, providing valuations using our AVM. But as part of that relationship with the lenders, we have a reciprocal arrangement. So every time a surveyor is physically sent out to a property to undertake a valuation, that data is sent back to Hometrack because it helps to improve the accuracy of our AVM. Now, in practice, what that means is our comparable database, particularly for new build. So if we looked over the last 3 months, for example, we have 1,700% more comparable data than you would find through their registry.
1,700% more.
1,700% more.
Wow, that's
a pretty
impressive.
solid number.
Yeah. So land registry, typically, say pre-COVID, your average property would take 9 to 12 months to transact and be registered. New builds have always had a bit of a lag on. Currently, Land Reg are reporting a plus 13 months for over 50% of new build for registration. And that's causing a real challenge for developers and for anybody in the space that's trying to understand pricing for new build. Our mortgage survey valuations are essentially the price paid on a new property, whether it's a mortgage obviously underwritten on that property. We get that data in a 30-day window. And so we're providing that data as part of that data set to LandTech, using as part of the comparables information. But we don't just stop there. So one of the benefits of using surveyor data is there's additional attribute information that comes with that. So we better understand the individual properties. Land registry typically is just going to tell you the address of the property, the price paid, property type. We also have the bed count, we have the floor area. We combine that with EPC data to further enhance some of the attribute information and other data. And we also use the listings data that we have as part of our sister business, Zoopla, to pull in richer information regarding the attributes. So two kind of key benefits, one being that at the leading edge, we're able to provide a whole host more data than you would get just from using listings information, which actually we're about 45% above listings overall in terms of volume of data. And then, as I say, 1,700% more than the land registry, but also that additional richness of that data, better understanding those individual properties. And we're attaching that to the listings as well. So what that means in practice, if you're a developer and you're looking at different sites and you're looking at the properties that are out there for comparable, actually you can better understand the specification because you can look at the photos, the floor plans, understanding the listing itself, understand the floor area, the price per square foot. And crucially, if you're only looking at listing information, there'd be one example of a particular property type that's being on that site. Developers aren't going to pay for multiple listings for the same property. But we have all that information in terms of those values that have been underwritten from the mortgage valuation. So if there's been 30 of a particular property type and we can see 8 of those properties already have a mortgage valuation against them, you can start backwards engineering sales rates and understanding which properties are going for what actual values.
I kind of want to swear just to sort of share my disbelief at the intensity of your data collection as well. It's incredible. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you, because obviously you are the developer, you're the co-host, you're a real developer, it's credited real developer. I mean, without kind of, I don't want to promote necessarily that that's the only way you can do things, but that data lag on land registry versus what Hometrack can achieve, I mean, that makes things so much simpler because obviously you're only good as the data, as we said, that you're putting in, and waiting 13 months to get some sort of idea of it, that's going to be a nightmare for developers.
Absolutely. Ultimately, you're only as good as the data you provided. And if you're getting up-to-date data like that, as well as, quality data and understanding exactly how that links to the product you're trying to deliver, is second to none.
Well, it's massive. And yeah, the whole purpose of the Real Developer podcast is to have real conversations about things that are genuine challenges and genuine opportunities. And we need the land registry, but 13 months really does not help the industry to push forward and to win more sites, to grow, to develop out new sites and to create housing that we need as well. So that's amazing and fair play in terms of what you have created. And that is a very, very powerful machine. One of the things that LandTech I know I can talk about, and I know a lot of the real developers and other developers that I speak to have shifted their kind of considerations around looking at options for holding stock, not necessarily full scale build to rent, but potentially refinancing. But we've also seen a shift in those that have decided actually they want to look at maybe slightly larger projects and take on that formal build to rent hat as well. How do you work with the rental sector and what kind of rental data do you guys provide?
Build to rent sector is an interesting one. In the UK, we're quite considerably behind pretty much the rest of the Western world. If you look at the States and you look at Europe, they're much further advanced in terms of build to rent and also their understanding of it and the appetite for being able to take on build to rent actual rental prices within the local market. So in the UK, we're still relatively in infancy in terms of pulling together those data sets and understanding that. What we do is we use the listings data that we pull from Zoopla, from our sister company, in conjunction with the other data sets that I talked about to really firm up the details that we have around those properties. And that can be a challenge for build to rent because obviously these properties are not being mortgaged onto the open market. But we're getting additional information through the EPC, we're getting additional information from the listing itself. We're able to address match those to about 85% across the UK.
85% accuracy or of
as
total
in 85%
market?
address matched. So
Okay.
of the listings information that we hold, we're able to address match about 85%
Okay.
of those. It's a real challenge to address match build to rent or any kind of rental property that's particularly a block of flats. So being able to do that is key to understanding where those assets are in relation to anything that you're looking to price in that local area. But we're able to look at that in relation to the rest of the market. So often build to rent is exceeding local market rental values. It's above the upper quartiles and the upper deciles in those areas. And understanding affordability and supply and demand metrics and understanding where people are moving to helps you to understand what potential headroom there is within that market. So relatively early days in terms of what we're doing specifically with LandTech. We're providing that comparable data. It's much richer than anything else available. It's probably worth noting that Zoopla have kind of the market share when you're looking at some of the major cities, areas like London and Birmingham, etc., on rental data and therefore build to rent. But we're also looking at what we can do to bolster that with supply and demand metrics, with affordability metrics. Ultimately, a lot of rental is driven by affordability, whether that be build to rent or otherwise. So understanding where there's headroom in those markets or where actually that affordability is becoming such a constraint that in the wider market, for example, is pushing people into first-time buying. They're actually moving even in the current climate because rental inflation has been so stark in the last 12 months. The other area that we work very heavily on is rental index. So we have a proprietary rental index within Hometrack that is widely seen as about 6 months ahead of the ONS indice, used by a lot of institutional investors across the market and build to rent players. So early stages in terms of what we can do. It's really difficult to get service charges and other information regarding build to rents in local areas, but actually understanding from the listings what's going out is certainly helping to understand that picture and bring in the affordability data.
You still provide the blend there between sort of secondary stock and obviously the more
we provide
your homes.
Whole of market.
Okay, understood.
When you talk about the rental market, Charlotte, that pulls in your 10-year publication that you recently released, talking about, I saw those figures in there, under 30s percentages. I think it's 30% would prefer to rent. It compare that to over 30 and upwards. It was a stark difference, and actually they'd prefer new builds, and there was some serious percentages in there, and quite interesting.
I think so. And I wonder whether that's also an affordability point of view. If people know that within the next 5 years, they're not going to be able to afford to move, then you're probably more likely to say, yes, we definitely prefer to rent. Yeah. So I think there's a little bit of that in there. I think also with the BTR sector coming through, the quality of rental properties out there is improving. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when people think about renting, it's not some really seedy sort of back room somewhere. Yeah. They are beautiful apartments and houses that are coming forward. And I know that the single family housing is even further behind sort of multi-unit blocks, but some of the facilities they've got on site completely blows anything else out the water, really. So I think there's a combination of that in there.
Absolutely. Argument to say that the last 2 years of data was affected heavily by COVID and government initiatives. How are Strutt and Parker appraising GDVs and values at the minute?
I think you're completely right. And it's very difficult with land registry being so out of date to just pull data from that and go, of course, I know exactly what these are going to be, particularly when a lot of new build developments we're looking at now, they're trying to bring something different to the market. So there's not direct comparables anyway. And then if you take into account that the data we're looking at might be a year behind as well, it is very difficult. So I split it down to sort of a 3-point process that we apply to all development appraisals that we do. And actually, it's very simple. There's no rewriting the book here. The first one is to understand the development properly. So it's to visit the site, which it's surprising how many people do not visit a site before they try and do a development appraisal on it. Doing your research, making sure that you pull as much information as possible, previous planning applications, why they were refused, if they were refused, current planning application, about the local area, et cetera, so you can build up that picture as to what the product is going to be at the end of that. The second one is the data, and this is where Land Insight and Hometrack come in very usefully. Land Insight in itself brings so much data forward that we can use as comparable information, and combining it with Hometrack now being far more relevant helps us to look at all the comparables that have been in the area and combining that with our local information as well. Obviously, as we all know, within towns, there's certain roads that are better than others and certain areas that are better than others within town. And we need to look at that as well and take that into consideration. So it might be that you've got a very similar development 2 miles away. It might be a completely different area, as we all know. So it's taking that into consideration as well. And the third one is then our local advice. So when we've pulled all that data together, it's then looking at how we can advise a developer on this honestly. I think a lot of agents have probably slipped into habits over the years of when they're doing a development appraisal for a developer, they want to put their best foot forward because they want the instruction at the end of it. Whereas the approach we take is very much, it's a partnership with the developers that we're working with. So when we're doing that appraisal, we want to give you the honest advice that this is where you could be and this is how we've got there, but we could make it even better.
Yep.
If you do this and this and this, then we can increase your GDV or we can increase your sales rates and we can appeal further to the local market. So it's not groundbreaking stuff. It's just doing things properly, I think.
It's added value, isn't it? It's
Exactly.
added value, and that's exactly what all developers are looking for in their agent, really.
Can I just ask a quick question? Just something you mentioned there as well, which I'm curious about. You mentioned about looking at previous planning applications, both approved and rejected.
Yeah.
How does the kind of the rejected piece, obviously I can understand, from we had our first 2 episodes covering off the sort of the local plan system and politics within planning, and I can understand how it fits. And then how do you use it from a new homes perspective? If there's been a number of rejected schemes for whatever reasons, how does that fit into the new homes piece?
It's just the background information more than anything. I think it builds up a site. Whenever I'm looking at a site, I like to know if planning applications have been rejected. Why was that? Was it local neighbours? So therefore, when we go forward to the sales perspective, we need to sort of look after the neighbours and do events with them, make them feel as if they have had some kind of involvement in this. Is it that it's something to do with the planning restrictions in the local area? So we need to be aware of those when we're, again, trying to sell the properties. It might come in helpful. If there's been something rejected because of parking and the parking situation has been rectified, when we're talking to buyers about the scheme, we can explain that the parking is amazing here and this is why it was amended, et cetera, et cetera. So it's added tools to our kit, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for taking me through that, because I hadn't really heard of that beforehand, but obviously shows why you guys are good at what you do. Fair play.
Charlotte, you mentioned product demand, and in your Life Moves publication, it showed different reasons or motivations for moves. What's hot and what's not going into 2024, because that's ultimately what every developer wants to know.
Yeah, and I think this is where it links really well into what you should build, because actually if you can look at what buyers want, tick those boxes,
Absolutely.
And you're sorted. So it was really interesting. Our Life Moves survey we do every year. We go out to about 2,000 buyers or potential buyers for the next 5 years. So those are people that are actively looking to move within the next 5 years. And we ask them 1,000,001 different questions about why they're looking to move and what kind of property they're looking to move to find out buyer trends over sort of a long period of time. So we have compared this year back to 2012. The top 3 come in at access to amenities, privacy, and running costs. Now, access to amenities and running costs have both gone up in sort of the stage of what people want over the last 10, 11 years. Privacy's actually come down. I don't think the access to amenities one is a particular surprise. It's all location, isn't it? The reducing costs and improved energy efficiency has been continually climbing over the last few years. So we're really seeing that shift for a buyer focus into that ESG space that we perhaps haven't seen before. So there's been a lot of government guidelines, legislation trying to push this forward, but has it ever given an increased GDV to a developer? So your costs are increasing, but your GDV hasn't been. Whereas that has now started to shift. And we've seen that from the information that's coming through with regards to EPCs as well. So EPC A and B will generally achieve a higher percentage on their asking price than if you've got a lower EPC. So it sort of all links together. But those 3 things, amenities, privacy, and energy efficiency, are top 3 hots at the moment.
So what's nots?
Well, the ones that have dropped down, should we say, rather than not important, the ones that have really dropped down over the last few years, smaller plot size. So I think post-COVID, there was a big trend. We want smaller gardens, low maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. That has sort of passed by now. Smaller homes, again, probably the same, although I think there is still a case for that ties in with downsizes and the energy efficiency there. So I don't think a smaller home is not important, but it's just making sure the space is right within the home, that it works for people. Close to family and friends. Don't know whether that's because we're approaching Christmas, maybe. The dreaded period. And better internet and broadband, which really, really surprised me. I thought that would continue to climb and climb. I don't know whether it's because people have now got more integrated systems at home, perhaps.
I was exactly the same.
Yeah.
I was really surprised to see that drop down.
Yeah.
But then I guess 10 years ago, there was it's an
There's greater disparity as well.
That's so true.
expectation now. It's there.
Yeah.
So you don't, it's an expectation.
I mean, you can get Wi-Fi on planes now, can't you?
Exactly.
So people
So it's a given.
probably don't consider it an important feature when they're going out to shop for a home. Exactly.
Yeah.
So some interesting ones in there, I think, as well. The only other one was lifestyle change. And I think, again, that's the post-COVID thing. Everybody was so big on lifestyle change and they were going to revolutionize the way they lived after COVID. I think that's just fallen down priority lists rather than not being a priority now.
Yeah, the walks have dropped off.
Yeah, exactly.
Ross, I know you've got some information being released, a report being released shortly. I know we don't get it at time of recording, but is there any insights you can share with us from your side, but also reflecting maybe on some of Charlotte's pieces? Because I know you have a slightly different sort of buyer group viewpoint as well.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting over the last kind of 6 months, 12 months, looking at the impact that the interest rates and things like ESG actually is increasingly important, not just for consumers, but also for the lenders and how they're looking at mortgages on properties. And I think there's a lot more to come on that in the future. But in terms of supply and demand and understanding kind of buyer groups and who those buyer groups are, in some ways it hasn't changed dramatically, but in other ways we are seeing a nuanced change. So first-time buyers, for example, still one of the largest groups in the UK, and that's growing. And part of that is because they're being pushed out of rental, ironically, because we've had the rental inflations that we have, despite the fact that we're seeing the interest rate rises, particularly in areas where affordability, there's still some headroom on that affordability. We're continuing to see first-time buyers being one of the biggest groups, so 1 in 3 at the moment. Less
Still first-time buyers?
Less so in new build. So this is more in the second-hand market. And that's because ultimately, when you look at the premium on a new build property against second-hand, that creates more of a challenge in terms of affordability. So we're seeing a bit of a constraint there in terms of new build, and probably something that developers need to consider. Cash buyers being number 2, being a significant, or number 2/3, being a considerate group. They're continuing to buy and they're looking to downsize and side trade. And that's really trying to make those energy efficiency moves. It's trying to move to the locations that provide that lifestyle. So a lot of the areas that you just talked about is actually very relevant to those cash buyers. And we're continuing to see that group buy, and we expect them to be a considerable group for next year. The other area is trader uppers, so people on their first or second move from their first home. Now, again, they're having some challenges with the interest rates. They typically have a higher level of debt or looking to take on a higher level of debt than first-time buyers and obviously than cash buyers. And that means that they're being constrained further, but there'd still be a group that we would expect to see looking at new homes within the market. Some of the kind of other nuances and interesting areas actually around overseas investors. So historically, we've had...
I wanted to ask about it, yeah.
Yeah, so we've had quite a lot of overseas investors into the UK market, Chinese, Russian, and others. We've seen a lot of that come back, as in scale back. So stopping that level of investment at the level that was previously happening. The one kind of anomaly to that is Turkish investment.
Okay.
So because of the hyperinflation that we're seeing in Turkey, they're looking for other markets to basically put their money to avoid the inflation that's happening over there. Moving into next year, what we're really expecting to see, if mortgage rates stay at around the 4 to 5% mark, we're expecting to see prices kind of pretty similar to this year. So we're running at about minus 0.1. We expect to see low digit price reductions next year. Minus 1.1 in terms of price reduction is national. So that's when you start looking at regions, that changes. You look at Edinburgh, it's running at about 2.2%. Liverpool, Manchester, about 0.1%. So tiny amounts, nominal growth, pretty much staying the same. But when we reflect that from last year, when we were up at the 4s, 5 and 6%, that's quite considerable change in those areas. There's still a little bit of affordability headroom. In London, minus 2%, Southeast, minus 2.2%. These kind of changes in prices can be okay for the majority of people. They've bought a property in less recent times than the last 12 months, and therefore we're not talking about negative equity or anything like that. But obviously this does have an impact, and it's something that new build need to consider, developers need to consider when we're seeing those levels of price reductions nationally, and expect to see probably 2-3%, maybe 4% next year in terms of price reductions nationally. The other area that's really important to take into account is volume. So actually we have seen quite a significant reduction. I'm sure you've seen this as well. In terms of sales volume in the UK, we're expecting to probably hit around 1 million transactions this year. And if you look at the long run trend of about 1.2 million, that's about 200,000 down. we're expecting that to continue into next year as well. So a number of kind of areas and factors that really developers do need to consider, kind of focusing on those trader uppers, those cash buyers. You're absolutely right. The slightly smaller 3-4 bedroom properties that are an appropriate down trade, still want some garden space, want to ensure that it's a more energy efficient, easier home to run and manage. And then thinking about the fact that obviously with that lower demand, you really need to make sure that your data is right. You're not relying on marginal sites and interest rates running them away. Very much focusing on making sure the marketing and the data is right to drive in those right individuals for those properties.
And that's where obviously your good agent or your great agent partner comes in to make sure you bring that all to life as well. And I know we get to grab you for another episode to kind of talk about some of those strategies and the advice for the developers. Just to bring us to a close on this particular piece, and it does feel like we've sort of, I don't know if we've done ourselves a favor by cutting this to a 30-minute episode, but I feel like there's a lot more we can unpack and it's not fair to condense it down, but we have to for the sake of our audience to try and keep it focused on a couple of key questions. One of the pieces we always like to finish with is just to ask from your perspectives. I mean, Ross, you've covered off a number of suggestions there that developers should be mindful of. If you were going to condense it down, even the advice you've already given, Charlotte, obviously you get to speak to a lot of developers like Mitchell and other great firms every day. What would your advice be in terms of running the most accurate appraisals possible at the moment? Because obviously developers are always going to come to you with their own appraisal and ask you to kind of share your views. They're going to hope to supercharge their appraisals alongside your data, but you obviously want to try and guide them as how to use it in the best way possible, whether it's with Land Insight or any other or direct. What's your advice, Charlotte, if you can go first for the real developers and SMEs out there?
The first one would be to engage with agents at an early enough stage. We see so many developers that sort of come to us later down the line to fix a problem that they've got with their development appraisal rather than involving us at the beginning. We like to get involved with developers when you're looking at a site to start off with. Let us help with what's going to go on there and why it's going to go on there to end up with the best GDV at the end rather than trying to do it the other way around. So that would be number one. Number two is relevant market research. So again, looking at Hometrack, looking at relevant data rather than the data that works for your appraisal. And the third one is realistic revenue projections. So often we see developers who want to make a site work or they need their lender to make a site work. So therefore it's, can we go a little bit higher? Can we go a little bit higher? And actually, I always think it's better to be very realistic at the beginning and then the cream on top is the nice bit. You're not trying to backpedal from there. So those would be the three bits from me.
I think for me, pretty obvious that I'm going to say this, but data is everything. It really is, especially in a market like we see today. I mean, there are reasons to remain optimistic, despite the fact we're going to see low reductions and some price falls. 16% of the population actually want to move in the next 2 years. That's a pretty positive stat. But actually making sure that those sites do work, as you were just alluding to with the market research, you need to use good quality data. There are so many sources now of data in the market. And some of that data is very, very cheap. But very much you get what you pay for when it comes to data. And what you do see is a lot of data sets out there that will give the answer that perhaps someone wants to hear rather than the reality. I won't name any names of that type of data, but it's really crucial to understand the source of the data, the methodology behind that data. How has that answer been derived? What information, what credentials are behind that? Because ultimately, if you're a land director or you're taking an appraisal to a funder, you're looking to get your funds, you don't want to be stood there with something that you're not 100% positive that the information behind it is correct, because you could lose your shirt. But very simply, making sure that you've got the right data to make informed decisions.
Good advice, Ross. Charlotte, thank you very much for your input. And to my awesome co-host, Mitchell, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex.
We'll see you for the back for the next episode. Hello everyone, it's your host Alex Harrington-Griffin again, just to say thank you for joining us for this episode. If you liked it, hit the like button, subscribe, and of course, share it with your peers. A big thank you to our partners LandTech for powering this episode. If you want to find out more about their products like Land Insight or Land Fund, go to land.tech or follow LandTech on LinkedIn for SME developer updates, finance updates, and of course the data and research mentioned in this episode. We'll see you back for the next session when we get into some real development conversation. Thank you.